to make a point. Now, let's jump into the questions. My first question is, why there was no official canonization of Hadith like that of the canonization of the Quran under Abu Bakr and Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhum. And number 2 is that 80 to 85% of Hadith, as we know, are from 7 or 8 people, which is not a problem in itself, but there are contradictions in the Hadith narrated by these 7 or 8 people in the books like Bukhari and Muslim, and we have to understand what are the implications of this. Now let's first look at the question number 1. Now, if Hadith was mandatory to understand the Quran and the Islamic law in the first 100 or 200 years, then why there was no official Hadith canonization like that of the canonization of the Quran under the Rashidun Khilafah? It's not that they did not understood the importance of compilation and canonization. In fact, they did compile and canonized the Quran under Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. But why did not they do it for the Hadith if it was mandatory? Now, one might say that they could not do it because of the First Civil War, Second Civil War, and so on. But that's not a very good argument, because the political civil wars were not obviously more important than that of canonizing and saving the prophetic tradition. In fact, there was not even an attempt made to do so. In fact, there was not even an attempt made to canonize and compile the official version. If one claims that there was no need for that because the companions were alive, then this is true for Quran as well, but they still canonized and compiled the Quran and not the entire prophetic tradition. But let's say, for the sake of our argument, that it was not realistically and logistically possible during the Rashidun Khilafah, but there was no attempt made to do so in the next 100 years, at least before Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Even that attempt was not to compile the entire tradition. Now, if one argues that this wasn't possible under the Umayyad because of the second fitna, or because the Umayyad dynasty did not enjoy the legitimacy from every section of Muslim society, then this wasn't the case for the first 20 years under Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And forget about the kings and the emperors of the Umayyad dynasty. There was not even a demand from the popular segment and the scholarly segment of the Muslim population as well. Time constraint, resource constraint, and civil war cannot be an argument because despite all these, the Umayyads had the time and energy to expand geographically, but not so much preserving the prophetic tradition. So we can say that it was not an official enterprise nor a collective enterprise, but a personal enterprise of number of individuals in each generation to preserve the Hadith tradition, and especially in the first 100 years of the Rashidun and the Umayyad dynasty. And this personal enterprise itself was an enterprise of minorities in each level. For example, out of 12,300 or so Sahabas, only 962 narrated Hadith in the 6 books. Bukhari took Hadith from only 195 of them, and 7 of them actually narrated about 85% of all Hadith, which itself is not a problematic issue, except for the fact that there are contradictions among narrations from these individuals in the tradition. Which brings us to our second question, which is about 80 to 85% of the Hadith tradition comes from 7 or 8 of the companions, and there are contradictions in the Hadith narrated by these companions. For example, there are contradictions in the Hadith narrated by Aisha, Abu Huraira, Ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, and Anas ibn Malik in the books of Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. Now, most of our Hadith are in the form of single chain Hadith, and some of them are multiple chain of Hadith, either in the form of corroboration or multiple chain of the same Hadith or different Hadith on the same topic. Now, when this multiple chain occurs, in the minority cases presumably, a lot of time there are contradictions, just as I said earlier. Now, this has some implications. For example, when we have contradiction in multiple chain Hadith, does that mean that in case of single chain Hadith, if we had multiple chain from multiple companions, we would have contradictions in those versions as well? Then, if 80 to 85% of our Hadith were not from 7 or 8 people, rather 20, 25 people, would we have more contradictions? Now, what we have in our hand is great, but what we are missing out, was it greater? For example, as I said in previous video, that the chain like the Zain al-Abidin, Muhammad Baqir and Jafar Sadiq was not as prominent in the 6th book, maybe because of the political reason. After all, it wasn't the official canonization rather than personal enterprise, that too of a minority of the people in the first 100 years. And there were a lot of other knowledge enterprise going on in those times. For example, all the four madhab of classical Sunni mainstream were formed before the canonization of Hadith, and they were done at a time when the Hadith situation was much more fluid than the fixed picture we have in our mind today. And the four Imam and the other Imams of extinct mazhabs have all come up with methodologies that gave different priorities to Hadith, and different methodologies of Hadith was adopted for authenticating, interpreting, and application of the Hadith in case of Islamic law. Before the canonization of Hadith, during the time of the madhabs when they were being formed. I hope some of you will give some answers and we can take the discussion from there on. Thank you for watching this video.